Mr. Mercer, the board has already voted. Either you remove that security system by the end of the week, or you'll be fined every single day until you comply. Patricia Holloway's voice dripped with smug certainty as she leaned against the community clubhouse counter, arms folded. Lakeview Preserve has rules, and your fancy cameras aren't on the approved list. I didn't flinch. I let her finish, then slid a thin sealed envelope across the counter. You might want to check the manufacturer code stamped on the back of those cameras before you get too comfortable, I said quietly. Because I wrote the compliance standards for half the city's access systems, including the one your board hired to guard the clubhouse you're standing in. Her smirk faltered, just for a second. That was the crack I needed. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. I straightened, holding her gaze. My name's Daniel Mercer. I've lived here for 7 years. My father planted the oak tree at the front gate back when this community was nothing but mud and blueprints. That tree is still standing, and so am I. So if you think I'm just another neighbor you can intimidate with fines and letters, you're about to learn a hard lesson. Patricia scoffed, muttering something about residents who think they're special. But I could feel her annoyance deepen. She wasn't used to pushback, especially not from someone who knew exactly how her systems worked. The truth was, this wasn't about cameras or locks or some technical violation dreamed up in an air-conditioned office. It was about my wife, Emily. 7 months pregnant, confined mostly to bed because her blood pressure spiked at the smallest stress. Every doctor on her team had agreed. The house needed monitored access, the security system we chose, not the cookie-cutter one Patricia peddled. My wife's health and our unborn child's safety depended on it. I thought about Emily's smile when the baby's heartbeat echoed during the last scan, how fragile she looked when she whispered she was scared. I thought about my father, gone too soon, whose last words to me had been, "Protect what matters." That wasn't a slogan. It was the foundation of everything I was. Patricia wasn't just threatening me with fines. She was threatening my family's peace, my father's legacy, and the security of a woman carrying our future. And that was something I would never allow. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. Patricia, I know you thrive on intimidation, but there's something you should understand. When you use power the wrong way, it always leaves fingerprints. You've just left yours all over this. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. She wasn't sure how much I knew. That was exactly where I wanted her, off balance, second-guessing herself. Because while she thought she was tightening the leash, I'd already seen the flaw in her chain. My expertise wasn't theoretical. It was practical, certified, and documented. She'd stepped into a battle on my ground, and sooner or later, she'd regret it. So, here's my question for you. Where are you watching from? Because this isn't just a story about fines and rules. It's about how far one man will go when a self-appointed tyrant threatens his wife and child. Patricia Holloway believed she could use her title to bully me into silence. What she didn't realize is that she just picked a fight with someone who builds battlefields out of key codes, cameras, and evidence, and who's already buried people's careers for trying less. She thought the first letter she sent would scare me, but it only lit the fuse. And as she turned away that night, muttering about the board's final word, I made a quiet promise to myself. Patricia Holloway had chosen the wrong door to unlock, and when the time came, I'd make sure everyone in Lakeview Preserve saw the footage. Patricia's heels clicked against the clubhouse floor as she disappeared through the glass doors, leaving the faint scent of her perfume hanging like a warning. I stayed still, listening to the echo fade. When the silence settled, I stepped out into the cool night. The oak tree loomed at the entrance, its branches stretched wide as if shielding the entire neighborhood. My father's tree. Every time I saw it, the anger inside me hardened into resolve. She had no idea how deep the roots of my resistance went. By morning, her threats had spread like wildfire. Neighbors were already whispering. Some stopped me during my walk to the mailbox, their voices lowered. "She's after you now?" one asked. Another leaned in, shaking his head. "She's been waiting for a fight like this. Be careful." I heard the fear in their voices. Patricia thrived on that fear. Fines, violations, threats of foreclosure. It kept most of them compliant. The HOA's power wasn't just in the rules, it was in the perception that no one could stand against them. I walked back up my driveway, the cameras overhead clicking softly as they adjusted. To me, the sound was reassurance. To Patricia, it was provocation. That was why she wanted them gone, because they weren't under her control. Inside, Emily sat on the couch, hand resting on her stomach, her eyes tired but steady. "Another letter?" she asked, spotting the paper I held. "Not just a letter," I said. "She's making this public now." I didn't want Emily to feel the weight of it, but I couldn't shield her from the truth. Patricia was escalating, and soon it wouldn't just be about my system. It would be about whether I could protect my family at all. That afternoon, I received an official notice of escalated violation delivered by a courier. Patricia had stamped it with the HOA seal like it was a court order. Fines of $200 per day, retroactive to last week if I didn't remove the system. And tucked inside, a final line that made my blood run cold. Failure to comply may result in board action, including property lien or foreclosure proceedings. The arrogance was staggering. She thought she could leverage my own home against me, turn my sanctuary into a hostage. But she'd made a mistake. I knew the language of contracts, the technical definitions of compliance, and most importantly, I knew what her cameras couldn't see, the ways she bent the rules to keep her grip on everyone else. Late in the evening, I attended the HOA's monthly board meeting at the community pavilion. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, residents sitting stiff and silent, waiting for Patricia to speak. She stood at the front like a queen holding court, her voice loud, rehearsed. "Security systems must be standardized," she declared. "We cannot allow rogue installations to compromise neighborhood safety." Her eyes flicked to me, daring me to rise. I did. Slowly, deliberately. "Standardized systems, Patricia? That's rich. Do the neighbors know you've contracted a maintenance override that gives you master key privileges to every compliant lock in this neighborhood?" The room went still. Murmurs rippled through the rows. Some faces looked confused, others alarmed. Patricia stiffened, her smile faltering for the second time in as many days. "This isn't about safety," I continued. "It's about control. You want a monopoly on surveillance and access, and you're willing to weaponize the bylaws to get it." Gasps followed. I scanned the crowd and saw Marcus Reed standing near the edge, clipboard in hand. His jaw was tight, his eyes downcast, but I noticed his grip on the pen trembling. He knew. He'd been the one installing those systems under her direction. Patricia quickly regained her composure, waving her hands to dismiss my claim. "Baseless accusations. This resident has a history of exaggeration." She forced a laugh, but her voice carried strain. The meeting adjourned with her usual commands, but the silence afterward was different. People avoided her eyes, and for the first time, they looked at me not with pity, but with curiosity. A seed had been planted. When I returned home, the fines notice still sat on the counter. I picked it up, reading the words again. $200 per day. A lien on my property. It was meant to crush me into submission. Instead, it clarified everything. Patricia wanted war, and she had just declared it. I stood at the window, staring out at the oak tree. Its branches swayed against the evening sky, unmoved by threats or storms. My father's legacy, my wife's safety, my child's future. Patricia Holloway thought she was tightening her grip on this neighborhood. What she didn't see was the cracks spreading under her own foundation. She was certain she'd cornered me, but all she'd done was drive me to the place where I was strongest. Evidence, expertise, and the law. I didn't sleep much that night. The notice of fines still burned in my mind, its legal language coiled like a snake waiting to strike. But what stayed with me even more was Marcus Reed's face at the board meeting. The clipboard in his hand, the pen he nearly snapped in half, the way his jaw clenched when I exposed Patricia's master key privileges. He hadn't spoken a word, but his silence had spoken volumes. By morning, I decided I needed to see him. Not in a public meeting where Patricia's shadow loomed over everything, but somewhere he couldn't hide behind protocol. I found him in the maintenance shed near the tennis courts, bent over a workbench stacked with spare locks and bundled wires. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust. "Marcus?" I said, stepping inside. He froze for a moment, then straightened slowly, wiping his palms on a rag. His shoulders were broad, but they slumped as if carrying a weight heavier than any tool in that shed. His eyes didn't meet mine. "You looked like you had something to say last night," I added carefully. His lips pressed together. The rag twisted in his hands, wrung tighter and tighter until the fabric strained. He finally set it down, but his fingers wouldn't stop fidgeting, tapping against the bench, drumming against his thigh. Every gesture screamed conflict. "I install what I'm told," he muttered after a long silence, his voice rough, low. "It's not my place to question the board." I stepped closer. "But it is your place to protect this neighborhood. And you know what she's doing isn't about safety." Marcus's gaze flicked toward the door, then back to the pile of locks. He picked one up, turned it over in his hands, and set it down again. His throat worked as if he wanted to speak, but fear clamped his words shut. The silence stretched. I could almost hear his pulse in the room. "You were there when she ordered the overrides, weren't you?" I pressed. "You saw the paperwork. You know she pushed for access that no HOA president should ever have." His shoulders twitched. He didn't confirm, but he didn't deny it either. Instead, he rubbed at the back of his neck, a nervous habit that left a faint streak of grease on his collar. His body betrayed the truth he couldn't yet say aloud. "I know what it's like to feel trapped," I said softly. "She uses her title like a weapon. Makes people afraid to stand up. But this is about more than fines and rules. She crossed into my family's safety, Marcus. My wife's safety. You saw what she did at that hospital." His jaw tightened, and for a moment his eyes met mine. Guilt flickered there, sharp and undeniable. His fingers drummed faster against the bench, then stopped abruptly as he balled his hands into fists. "I can't," he whispered, shaking his head. "If I speak up, I lose my job. I lose everything I didn't push further, not yet." The fear was too fresh, the grip too strong, but I saw the crack widening. He was torn between survival and conscience, and Patricia's arrogance had put him in the center of it. I turned toward the door, pausing with my hand on the frame. "I don't need you to go down with her," I said quietly. "But when the time comes, I need you to remember who you're protecting, her power, or this community." I left him standing in the dim shed, shoulders rigid, fists clenched, eyes fixed on the locks like they held the answer he couldn't say. That evening, I drove past the clubhouse again. Patricia's car sat parked out front, its headlights still warm. She was inside, no doubt scheming her next letter, her next threat. She thought the board was unified, her control complete. She had no idea one of her own was already wavering. The oak tree at the entrance loomed tall against the fading sky, its silhouette steady and unbroken. I pulled over for a moment, staring at it, letting its presence ground me. My father had planted it for endurance, for strength through seasons and storms. And now it reminded me of something critical. Endurance wasn't about standing alone, it was about lasting long enough for others to find their courage. Marcus Reed hadn't spoken yet, but his silence, his trembling hands, his guilty eyes, they told me everything I needed to know. The crack in Patricia's foundation was widening, and soon it would split open. The crack in Patricia's foundation was widening, but she couldn't see it. By the next morning, she had escalated her campaign into something bolder, more brazen. A bright orange notice flapped against my front door, nailed down with an HOA seal. The words screamed across the page, "Final demand, immediate removal required." Emily found it before I did. She stood in the hallway, one hand clutching her stomach, the other gripping the notice so tightly the paper crumpled. Her lips were pale, and I could see the tremor in her fingers. "She can't keep doing this," she whispered. "She can try," I said, taking the paper from her hand, smoothing it flat on the counter. The fines had doubled overnight. $400 a day, escalating penalties. A foreclosure timeline laid out in cold legal language. Patricia wanted to break me fast, drain me until resistance seemed impossible. I folded the notice carefully and slid it into a folder I had begun keeping. Evidence. Every overreach she committed was another weapon in my arsenal. But still, the sight of Emily's stress gnawed at me. Patricia wasn't just threatening our home. She was chipping at Emily's health, one letter at a time. That afternoon, I attended a neighborhood gathering at the lakeside gazebo. It was supposed to be a casual cookout, the kind of thing meant to foster community, but Patricia had twisted it into a stage. She stood with a clipboard in hand, smiling as she circulated, whispering in ears, showing off copies of violation records. She was turning me into the example, the neighbor who dared to defy her rules. I stayed at the edge of the crowd, listening. Words floated through the air. Non-compliant, dangerous system, refuses to cooperate. Fear worked its way into conversations, neighbors glancing at me, then quickly away. Patricia's talent wasn't in rules, it was in narrative. She made me the villain to reinforce her throne. When she spotted me, her smile sharpened. "Mr. Mercer," she said loudly, so half the crowd turned to look. "I hope you're enjoying yourself, despite being at the center of so much controversy." I met her gaze, unshaken. Controversy doesn't bother me. Lies do. The words cut, but I didn't press further. This wasn't the moment. The crowd wasn't ready to hear the full truth. Not yet. They were still under her spell, and she thrived on the appearance of control. But every performance left more fingerprints, and I was collecting all of them. As the sun dipped lower, I found myself near Marcus. He lingered by the grill, tongs in one hand, his expression distant. When Patricia spoke, his shoulders stiffened, and when she laughed, his eyes narrowed. He didn't say anything, but his silence was different this time, less about fear, more about anger simmering beneath the surface. He avoided looking at me, but the way his hand tapped against the metal table gave him away. I stayed until the crowd began to thin, then walked back to my car parked along the lakeshore. Patricia thought she had staged a victory, parading my name like a warning sign. But what she didn't realize was that the more public her campaign became, the more reckless she grew. Recklessness left trails, and trails could be followed. That night, I spread the papers across my dining room table. Violation notices, escalation letters, penalty sheets. Each one a record of intimidation. I highlighted the dates, cross-referenced the language, circled contradictions in policy. It was more than a pattern of abuse. It was negligence wrapped in arrogance. I knew the codes, the statutes, the compliance language. Patricia believed she could hide behind bylaws and the HOA charter, but her threats overstepped both. She was forging her own version of authority, and I could already see where the cracks in her legal shield would give way. The oak tree swayed outside my window as I worked, branches silhouetted against the moonlight. I thought of my father again, the promise I had made to protect what mattered. Patricia had just escalated her war into the public square, and now every move she made was recorded. Every word she spoke became a thread I could pull loose. She thought she was writing the narrative of my downfall, but in truth, she was scripting her own undoing. She thought she was scripting my downfall, but every reckless stroke of her pen only built the case I would use against her. By the following morning, I was back at my office downtown. It wasn't just a place of work. It was the command center where I analyzed systems, audited compliance, and advised corporations on the very rules Patricia was so eager to twist. If there was any ground where I held absolute authority, it was here. I spread her notices across the desk, each one marked with her signature and the HOA seal. I opened my laptop and pulled up the city's building and security code regulations. Page after page, I matched her language against the law. It didn't take long to find the first crack. Patricia had cited mandatory system conformity under HOA security compliance policy. There was just one problem. No such policy existed in the governing documents filed with the county. I dug deeper, opening the HOA's recorded charter and cross-referencing it with city code. My cursor hovered over section after section until I stopped cold at a clause Patricia had either overlooked or willfully ignored. Any regulation that affects health and safety systems required board approval by 2/3 majority and, in some cases, city inspection. Patricia had neither. She had been issuing fines without legal standing. That was the moment my strategy crystallized. This wasn't going to be a shouting match on her turf. This was going to be dismantling her authority piece by piece, using the very codes and statutes she pretended to enforce. But discovery doesn't always come from screens. My phone buzzed, a text from a hospital administrator. I had once consulted for on a compliance project. Need to discuss your HOA president, urgent. My stomach tightened. I called back immediately, closing my office door. She requested override access to your wife's room, the administrator said carefully. She claimed it was part of a neighborhood safety agreement. I denied it, but she tried. We logged the attempt. I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles whitened. I had known Patricia was reckless, but this was beyond reckless. It was intrusion into protected medical space, and the fact that she had even attempted it left a paper trail. "Send me the log entry," I said, my voice steady despite the heat rising in my chest. "I'll handle the rest." An hour later, the file hit my inbox. A simple line in a digital access record. Override request by Holloway, Patricia. Denied. Reason: unauthorized request. It was small, almost clinical in wording, but it was the first undeniable piece of evidence connecting her ambition to criminal overreach. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Patricia believed she was untouchable, that her threats carried the weight of law. But here, in black and white, was proof that she had stepped beyond bylaws and into something far more serious. Tampering with medical, privacy, and security. The oak tree outside my home might have represented legacy, but this file represented leverage, and leverage was the one thing Patricia could not control. I printed the record and slid it into the evidence folder, alongside her notices and letters. My strategy was no longer just about exposing her misuse of HOA authority. It was about showing that her hunger for control had crossed legal boundaries no judge could ignore. When I left the office that evening, the city skyline glowed against the darkening sky. The path forward was clearer now. Patricia's arrogance had left fingerprints on everything she touched, and I had just uncovered the first one that couldn't be erased. I knew what came next: build the case, protect Emily, and when the time was right, pull back the curtain so the entire community could see the truth. Patricia Holloway thought she was the only one writing this story. But in my office that night, surrounded by codes, statutes, and evidence, I realized I was the author of her ending. I drove home from the office with the hospital's access log still heavy in my briefcase, the weight of it more than just paper. That single line, Patricia's name tied to an override attempt, had transformed this fight. It was no longer about violations and fines. It was about intrusion into sacred ground, a hospital room where Emily and our unborn child were supposed to be safe. When I pulled into the driveway, the cameras I had installed whirred softly as they tracked me. I paused by the oak tree at the entrance, letting my hand rest against the rough bark. My father's voice echoed in memory. Protect what matters. I had thought about those words countless times, but tonight they carved deeper. Patricia's obsession wasn't just strangling me. It was bleeding into the lives of the people I loved most. Inside, Emily sat with a blanket draped over her lap, flipping through a baby namebook. She looked up, exhaustion in her eyes. "Another letter?" she asked. "Worse," I said, placing the folder on the coffee table. I opened it to the access log, sliding it across to her. She read the line, her lips parting, her free hand tightening around the blanket. "She tried to get into my room," Emily whispered. "At the hospital?" "She tried," I said, keeping my voice calm. "She didn't succeed. But it means she's not just threatening us from the outside anymore. She's crossing into places she doesn't belong." Emily pressed her hand to her stomach, as if shielding the baby. Her silence was louder than any words, a reflection of the weight we were both carrying. Later that night, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The street lamps cast pools of light across driveways, illuminating mailboxes lined like soldiers. Most houses were quiet, blinds drawn, televisions flickering in the background. But the silence felt heavy, like everyone knew what Patricia was doing, yet chose to look away. Fear kept them compliant. At the end of the street near the community pool, I saw Marcus again. He was locking up the gates, keys jangling in his hand. His movements were mechanical, but his posture betrayed him. Shoulders hunched, head low, every step heavy. "Marcus," I called softly. He turned, startled, then exhaled as if bracing himself. "You shouldn't be out here making this worse for yourself," he muttered. His hand fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before scooping them back up. It's already worse, I said, stepping closer. She tried to override hospital access. For Emily's room, his eyes snapped to mine, and in that instant, his mask cracked. The keys stilled in his hand, but his knuckles whitened around them. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. You know it's true, I pressed. You've seen the requests. You've probably been the one forced to carry them out. Marcus's gaze darted to the houses around us, then back to me. He shifted his weight, tapping the keys against his thigh, the metallic clinking rapid and uneven. I don't want to get involved, he said finally, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. You already are, I replied. You're the one she leans on, the one who makes her orders real. But you don't have to be her shield, not anymore. He stared at me for a long moment, then looked away, shoving the keys into his pocket. His silence wasn't denial. It was fear and guilt twisting into something sharper. I walked home under the glow of the street lamps. The image of Marcus's trembling hand burned into my mind. Patricia's empire was cracking from within, and Marcus was the fault line. He wasn't ready to step forward, not yet, but he was teetering on the edge. And when the weight of her crimes grew too heavy, I knew he would fall toward the truth. Back at the house, I stood once more by the oak tree, its branches stirring in the night breeze. Patricia believed she held every card, but tonight proved otherwise. She had crossed into forbidden ground, and in doing so, she had given me something stronger than her fines or threats: urgency. This fight wasn't about rules anymore. It was about survival, and I was done waiting. The night breeze still clung to me when I stepped back inside, but sleep was out of reach. The evidence I carried, the fear etched into Emily's face, Marcus's trembling hands, it all wove together into a storm that refused to quiet. Patricia had crossed lines she couldn't uncross, but until someone from her own circle admitted the truth, it was still my word against hers. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. The following afternoon, I found Marcus waiting near the maintenance truck by the service lot behind the community clubhouse. His posture was restless, pacing, pausing, rubbing at the back of his neck. He wasn't the kind of man to seek me out without reason. You got a minute? He asked, voice low, eyes darting to make sure no one lingered nearby. I nodded, stepping closer. What's on your mind? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a folded sheet from his pocket. The paper creased and smudged as if it had been gripped too tightly for too long. His hands shook as he offered it to me. I shouldn't be showing you this, he muttered. I unfolded it carefully. It was a maintenance directive, stamped with the HOA's seal, signed by Patricia herself. The language was blunt. Authorize installation of override access across compliant systems. Board approval implied. Immediate execution required. My chest tightened. It was exactly what I'd suspected, but now I had it in writing. She told me it was routine, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. Said it was about streamlining community safety. But I knew it wasn't right. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and no board president has ever had that kind of authority. He leaned against the side of the truck, his arms crossed, but it wasn't confidence. It was defense. His jaw worked as though he was biting down on the words he didn't want to release. You were the one installing them, I said quietly. You saw exactly what she ordered. His eyes squeezed shut. When he opened them again, they shone with guilt. I did. And I kept my mouth shut because she signs the checks. Because I've got a mortgage, kids in school, I couldn't risk it. But when I saw her at that hospital, trying to push her way past limits that aren't hers, God, I couldn't shake it. The confession hung in the air like thunder before rain. He rubbed his hands over his face, dragging them down until his features sagged. I thought I could just do my job, pretend it wasn't happening. But last night, when you said she tried to get into your wife's room, I knew I couldn't keep covering for her. I folded the directive back into my pocket, my heartbeat steady despite the adrenaline surging in my veins. You don't have to cover anymore. This is what tips the scale. Marcus stared at me, conflict still etched into the tight lines of his brow. If this comes out, she'll know it was me. She'll bury me. Not if you stand on the side of the law, I said. Not if you stand with the people she's been trampling. He let out a long, uneven breath. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, I saw not just fear, but relief breaking through. He had carried the weight of her orders too long, and giving me that paper had shifted it. The moment ended abruptly when the clubhouse door opened. Patricia's laughter spilled into the air as she stepped out with another board member, her voice sharp and performative. Marcus stiffened instantly, every muscle snapping back into tension. He gave me the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, before climbing into his truck. As Patricia's voice carried across the lot, bragging about neighborhood order, I felt the folded directive press against my chest pocket like a brand. I had more than suspicion now. I had her signature tying her to the abuse of authority, and Marcus's reluctant confession to back it up. I walked back toward the oak tree at the neighborhood entrance, the branches swaying as if in approval. My father had planted it for strength, but tonight it felt like a witness. For the first time since this war began, I wasn't standing alone. Patricia Holloway thought fear would keep everyone silent. She didn't account for guilt, and guilt had finally spoken. The directive burned against my chest as I walked back through the neighborhood. Patricia's laughter still echoed from the clubhouse, but it no longer carried the same sting. I had her signature, her words, her proof, and with Marcus's reluctant confession, the lines of this battle were finally sharp. She wasn't just a bully wielding HOA bylaws, she was a figure of authority caught reaching far beyond her legal grasp. But evidence alone wasn't enough. To expose Patricia, I needed a plan built on precision, the kind of plan that would leave no room for her to twist the narrative. She was an expert manipulator, always able to spin fear into compliance. If I moved too soon, she'd bury the truth under lies. If I moved too late, Emily's safety would remain in jeopardy. Timing and execution mattered as much as the evidence itself. The next morning, I drove to a coffee shop on the edge of town. It was far enough from Lakeview Preserve that Patricia's board members wouldn't wander in, but close enough for me to keep the neighborhood within reach. The air smelled of roasted beans and fresh pastries, the kind of place where students typed furiously on laptops and retirees lingered over newspapers. For me, it became the war room. I opened my laptop and spread the documents across the table. Violation notices, penalty letters, Marcus's directive. Then I added the hospital log, the digital entry that proved Patricia had tried to override Emily's room access. Piece by piece, I began mapping the trail, each document linked to the next, like gears in a machine, turning steadily toward her undoing. I drafted outlines of potential arguments, cross-referencing them with legal statutes. Patricia's overreach violated at least 2 state-level codes, one tied to medical privacy, another to HOA authority limits. If presented correctly, both could render her fines null and void, and expose her to penalties she couldn't spin away. Still, a plan wasn't just about what I knew, it was about how the community would see it. Patricia's power rested on the illusion of order, the belief that the HOA's rules were unshakable. To break her hold, I needed to shatter that illusion in front of everyone. Marcus's directive was the keystone. It proved Patricia acted unilaterally, without board approval, violating the very charter she claimed to defend. But I couldn't reveal it carelessly. If she caught wind of my evidence before the right moment, she'd rally her allies, rewrite records, and bury Marcus under retaliation. I sipped my coffee, eyes narrowing as the plan crystallized. I would take the evidence to a judge, but not in secret. I would force Patricia into the open, into a forum where neighbors and officials could witness her unraveling. A courtroom hearing, or a public HOA meeting. It didn't matter which came first, as long as the exposure was undeniable. By mid-afternoon, I had built a timeline. Patricia's first violation notice, the escalation of fines, the unauthorized override attempt, and finally, the directive Marcus provided. Each step escalated not only in aggression, but in illegality. A judge would see it. Neighbors would see it. The truth would no longer belong to me alone. I leaned back in my chair, the murmur of the cafe around me fading into the background. My mind returned to Emily, resting at home, her hand protectively over her stomach. She didn't need to know every detail of the plan, just that I was building something that would protect her and the life we were waiting for. Before leaving, I scanned the directive into a secure drive, encrypting the file, backing it up across 3 separate systems. Patricia might think she could silence Marcus, but even if fear closed his mouth again, The evidence would endure. That evening, I drove back into Lakeview Preserve, headlights sweeping over the oak tree at the entrance. Its branches bent slightly in the breeze, shadows stretching across the road like arms guiding me forward. My father had planted it to mark beginnings, but tonight it marked momentum. The fight had shifted. Patricia Holloway believed her authority was absolute. But from that cafe table, with her signature captured and her lies laid bare, I built the blueprint that would dismantle her power piece by piece. And when the moment came to reveal it, there would be no turning back. The oak tree's shadow followed me home that night, a silent reminder that the groundwork was done, and now came the hard part. Preparation. Patricia's power had thrived in silence and secrecy. To break her, I had to make every hidden act visible, and that meant gathering not just evidence, but witnesses, allies, and momentum. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. The building was a squat brick structure, plain and bureaucratic, its hallways lined with filing cabinets and the faint hum of old fluorescent lights. Here, beneath dust and paperwork, lived the backbone of every HOA, its charter, bylaws, amendments, and filings. Patricia loved to wave them around at meetings, but I suspected half of what she cited never actually existed in official form. I signed in, gave the clerk the HOA's name, and waited as she wheeled out a cart stacked with folders. I pulled one open and began scanning the yimbist text. My fingers traced every section of authority limits, every clause on board approval. As I compared Patricia's violation letters with the filed bylaws, the gap widened into a canyon. Her language didn't just bend the rules, it invented them. Buried in the records, I found what I needed most, a clause requiring any system affecting health and safety to undergo both city approval and a board vote by supermajority. There was no evidence either had been done. Patricia had acted alone, rubber stamping her orders as if she were the entire board. By the time I closed the last folder, I had a stack of copies marked with highlighted sections. It was tedious work, the kind most neighbors would never attempt. But this was where my expertise gave me an edge. Codes, clauses, compliance. This was my battlefield. I stepped outside into the bright afternoon, the weight of the documents under my arm. Across the street stood the courthouse, its stone steps gleaming in the sun. Soon enough, I'd walk through those doors, not as a man begging for relief, but as a professional dismantling an opponent who thought herself untouchable. But exposure required more than statutes. It required human voices. That evening, I visited the house of a neighbor named Ellen, one of the longest residents of Lakeview Preserve. Her porch light glowed warmly as she opened the door. "Daniel," she said, surprise flickering across her face. "Patricia's been talking about you." "I know," I replied. "That's why I need to talk about her." Over cups of tea at her kitchen table, I explained what Patricia had done, carefully sliding the highlighted copies across to her. Ellen's hands trembled slightly as she read, her lips tightening. "She said it was all in the charter," Ellen whispered. "She said if we didn't comply, the neighborhood could lose insurance, property values." "She lied," I said firmly, "and I can prove it." Her eyes lifted to mine, searching. Then, slowly, she nodded. "If you bring this forward, I'll stand with you. Someone has to." It wasn't a tidal wave of support, not yet, but it was the first ripple. Patricia had ruled with fear, but neighbors like Ellen still carried a quiet sense of justice waiting to be awakened. Back home, I spread the day's findings across the dining room table, adding them to the growing binder of evidence. Emily watched from the couch, her face pale but resolute. "You're building something solid," she said softly. "I have to," I replied. "Because when this breaks open, Patricia will try to bury it under noise. The only way through is to make the truth undeniable." I slid Marcus's directive into place beside the county filings, the hospital log behind it, and the violation letters at the front. Layered together, they told a story Patricia couldn't control, a story of overreach, of lies, of authority wielded like a weapon. The neighborhood outside was still quiet, blinds drawn against conflict, but I knew that silence wouldn't last. Patricia's arrogance had blinded her to the truth, that every system leaves a record, and every abuse leaves a scar, and soon both records and scars would stand against her. The binder lay open on the dining room table, every page in order, every piece of evidence aligned like rounds in a chamber. Patricia had built her power on intimidation and bluster, but paper doesn't lie. Still, evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed to position it, to set the stage so that when the truth emerged, it couldn't be dismissed or drowned in her theatrics. The next step took me to the community library, a low brick building tucked at the edge of town. Its quiet halls and rows of books offered a kind of sanctuary from the noise Patricia stirred in the Lakeview Preserve. More importantly, it offered access to resources most residents never thought to touch: public legal databases, local archives, and a meeting room I could use without her oversight. I carried the binder under my arm, claiming a table near a window where sunlight spilled across the wood. I spread out my materials: violation notices, bylaws, Marcus's directive, the hospital log, and began drafting what would become the backbone of my case. My training kicked in, the same discipline I used when auditing corporate systems. Identify the flaw, document it, and present it in a way that left no doubt. As I worked, I compiled a timeline. Day 1, the first violation notice. Day 14, fines doubled. Day 21, the override attempt logged at the hospital. Each escalation mapped neatly into the next, a pattern of abuse growing more severe with every step. Judges didn't want chaos. They wanted clarity, and clarity was exactly what I intended to deliver. Halfway through the afternoon, I requested the library's printer to churn out duplicates of key sections. The rhythmic hum filled the quiet, each page sliding into the tray, a reminder that Patricia's empire was already crumbling. For years, she'd wielded fear like a weapon, but she had never faced someone who could dismantle her power with the very language she pretended to uphold. When the stack of copies was complete, I organized them into 3 sets: one for the court, one for the HOA board, and one for myself. If Patricia tried to suppress, deny, or destroy, she'd find that her reach couldn't erase every trail. That evening, I attended another board meeting. This time it wasn't in the pavilion, but in the HOA's official office, a sterile space tucked into a strip mall beside a dry cleaner and a dentist's practice. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh glow on the long conference table, where Patricia sat like a queen at court. Her allies flanked her, pens poised, expressions sharp with manufactured disdain. Neighbors filled the back rows, some curious, some cautious. Ellen sat among them, her eyes steady, a silent show of support. Marcus stood near the side wall, clipboard in hand as always, but his gaze flickered toward me with something new: resolve. Patricia cleared her throat, beginning the meeting with her usual self-assured rhythm. We are here to address ongoing violations that threaten the safety and harmony of Lakeview Preserve. Mr. Mercer has refused to comply, despite repeated notices. The fines now exceed $4,000. Her words rang like a verdict already passed. When she paused, I rose slowly, carrying only a portion of the binder. I'm not here to argue compliance, I said, keeping my tone calm. I'm here to present facts. I laid down the first packet, highlighted bylaws, copied directly from the county records. Your fines are unenforceable. The bylaws require a 2/3 vote for any rule affecting safety systems. There is no record of such a vote. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Patricia stiffened, her smile tightening. Those interpretations are selective, she began, but I placed the second packet on the table. Then explain this, I said. Marcus's directive, stamped and signed. Your order for override access, issued without board approval. That's not selective, that's unilateral overreach. Gasps followed. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering. Marcus's jaw clenched as he stared at the paper, his silence now an unspoken confirmation. Patricia's face flushed. She tried to regain control, raising her voice. Irrelevant! The president has authority. Not according to the law, I interrupted, placing the hospital log on the stack, and certainly not when you attempted to override access into a protected medical facility. That's not authority, that's violation. The room fell silent. For the first time, Patricia had no quick retort. She glanced at her allies, but their eyes darted away, unwilling to tie themselves to the fire now burning at her feet. I didn't press further, not yet. This wasn't the final confrontation. That would come soon, in a courtroom where her theatrics couldn't save her. But tonight, I had shifted the ground beneath her feet. Neighbors no longer saw me as the man on trial. They saw Patricia for what she was, a president abusing power, exposed piece by piece. As I left the office, the fluorescent lights buzzing behind me, I felt the oak tree's memory again. Roots deep, branches wide. Patricia had tried to sever my place in this community, but instead, she had shaken the ground that held her, and the cracks were spreading fast. The board meeting had rattled Patricia, but it wasn't enough. She would never back down unless forced into a setting she couldn't control. That's why, less than a week later, I stood on the steps of the county courthouse, binder in hand, while the community gathered below. A judge had scheduled a preliminary hearing on the HOA's authority to enforce its fines, and word spread quickly through Lakeview Preserve. Neighbors who had once kept their blinds drawn now filled the courthouse plaza, murmuring as they waited for the doors to open. Emily couldn't be there. Her doctors insisted she rest, but I carried her presence with me. Every page of evidence, every highlighted clause was a promise to her and to the child she carried. Patricia had turned our fight into a spectacle. Now that spectacle would become her undoing. Inside, the courtroom filled fast. Rows of benches creaked under the weight of residents, reporters, and curious onlookers. Patricia swept in wearing a sharp suit, her chin lifted high, but I caught the tightness in her jaw, the stiffness in her stride. She wanted to look unshaken, but cracks had already formed. The judge called us forward. This hearing concerns enforcement actions taken by the Lakeview Preserve Homeowners Association against resident Daniel Mercer. Mr. Mercer, you may proceed. I rose carrying the binder to the podium. My voice was steady, professional, but every word was sharpened by the weight of months of abuse. Your Honor, this case is not about compliance. It is about authority, and whether the HOA president exceeded it. I placed the first packet on the bench. Here are the bylaws as filed with the county. They clearly state that any rule affecting safety systems requires a 2/3 board vote and, in some cases, city inspection. No such vote or inspection occurred, yet fines were issued, escalating daily, based on fabricated authority. The judge skimmed the pages, brow furrowing. Behind me, I heard whispers ripple through the crowd. Patricia's attorney objected, claiming interpretation, but I laid down the second packet. Marcus's directive. Signed by President Holloway herself, this order authorized override access across compliant systems, without board approval, without disclosure to residents. This is not interpretation. This is unilateral command. Gasps filled the room. I didn't look back, but I could feel the shift. Neighbors who had once feared Patricia now saw her signature tying her directly to the abuse. Patricia leaned toward her attorney, whispering fiercely, but the judge raised a hand for silence. Mr. Mercer, continue. I placed the final piece, the hospital access log. This document shows an attempted override request made by President Holloway for access into my wife's hospital room. The request was denied, but the attempt itself demonstrates a blatant violation of both medical privacy and the scope of HOA authority. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. A woman in the back rose to her feet, exclaiming, "She tried to get into a hospital room?" Others began whispering to one another, voices tinged with outrage. The illusion Patricia had cultivated for years was dissolving in real time. Patricia finally stood, her face flushed. This is all mischaracterized. I acted for the safety of the community. But the judge cut her off. Sit down, Ms. Holloway. You will have your chance. His voice carried authority. Patricia couldn't twist. From the corner of my eye, I saw Marcus in the gallery. He looked pale, his hands clasped together. But when the judge asked if the directive was authentic, he stood. His voice trembled, but his words were clear. Yes, Your Honor. I received that order from President Holloway directly. I carried out her instructions. The courtroom erupted again, louder this time. Patricia's composure shattered. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no defense came. The evidence was too precise, the testimony too damning. The judge banged his gavel. Order. The evidence will be reviewed in full, but it is clear that enforcement actions based on unauthorized directives cannot proceed. Fines and penalties are suspended pending further determination. This court takes the allegations regarding unauthorized access attempts extremely seriously. I returned to my seat, binder closed. Around me, neighbors whispered, not about me, but about Patricia. Ellen touched my arm briefly, her eyes shining with gratitude. Marcus sat down slowly, the relief on his face almost painful to watch. For the first time, Patricia's throne was gone. The crowd had seen the truth, not through my words alone, but through documents, logs, and her own signature. As I stepped out of the courthouse, the community followed. Dozens of eyes met mine, no longer fearful, but resolute. The oak tree back at Lakeview Preserve stood miles away, but I felt its presence in the air, the symbol of strength, endurance, and now, change. The courthouse steps felt different on the way out. A week earlier, neighbors would have averted their eyes, too afraid to be seen near me. But now, as I descended, people paused to shake my hand, to thank me, to whisper their own stories of Patricia's intimidation. The silence that had once shielded her was gone. She had ruled by fear, and fear had just been broken. Patricia exited minutes later, her stride quick, her face drawn. Reporters pressed close, their microphones raised, but she said nothing. Her attorney tried to block the questions, but the cameras still caught her expression. Red-cheeked, furious, and cornered. That image alone would spread faster than any letter she could write. I drove back into Lakeview Preserve that evening, headlights washing over the oak tree. For years, Patricia had used that gate as her symbol of authority, the checkpoint between freedom and her rules. But now, as the branches stretched wide in the moonlight, it felt like the tree itself had been reclaimed. No longer her symbol, but mine, our community's. At home, Emily sat on the couch, a blanket around her shoulders, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. She looked up when I entered, her eyes searching mine. "It's over," I told her. Relief softened her features. She didn't need the details. She just needed to know the storm had broken. I sat beside her, and for a moment, the weight of months lifted. The fines, the notices, the threats, they were no longer chains around us. The next day, the community gathered at the Lakeside Pavilion. It wasn't an official meeting, but nearly everyone came. Ellen stood near the front, speaking to small clusters of neighbors, pointing toward the courthouse printouts I had shared. Marcus stood off to the side, quieter than most, but for the first time, he didn't look ashamed. When I caught his eye, he gave me a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the role he had played. When I spoke, I didn't raise my voice like Patricia had always done. I simply laid the facts before them, the same way I had done in court. She acted without authority. She used fear to control us, but fear only works when we stay silent. Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Some residents spoke up, sharing stories of petty violations and intimidation tactics Patricia had used over the years. The pattern was clear now, and it no longer frightened them. It angered them. By the end of the evening, a petition to remove her from the board had begun circulating. Dozens signed it on the spot. Others offered to serve in her place, promising transparency, fairness, and respect. The community that had once been fractured by fear was stitching itself together, one signature at a time. I stayed back, letting them lead. This was never about me alone. It was about ensuring no one else's wife, no one else's family would face what mine had. As the sun dipped below the lake, turning the water gold, I stood near the edge of the pavilion, watching the community talk, not about rules, but about rebuilding. Patricia's reign had ended not with a bang, but with the truth laid bare for everyone to see. Later that night, I sat beneath the oak tree, the cool bark at my back, the leaves whispering overhead. My father's legacy stood as strong as ever. Emily's safety was no longer under siege, and our child, not yet born, would grow up in a neighborhood no longer chained by tyranny. Patricia Holloway had believed she could twist authority into ownership, but the law, the truth, and the community had stripped her power away. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.